I think when we look at the state of workplace organisation, we keep coming up against what seems to be a kind of perpetual vicious circle. We're facing an employer's offensive, the neoliberalisation, for want of a better term, of the workplace. But we live with comparatively low levels of combativity and struggle, and we're confronted by a conservative bureaucracy that prevents that struggle from breaking out often or generalising. And so the issue is, how do we get around that? And we've had various attempts over the last decade. We used to talk about political trade unionism, that, you know, one of the ways to increase confidence in the workplace was to relate to general political issues like the developing anti-capitalist movement or the Stop the War movement. More recently, we've had arguments about, you know, what we need to do is push the bureaucracy into taking action. That will create struggle, and then out of struggle, the possibilities for rank and file organisation will emerge, and that's kind of founded on the inertia of the bureaucracy. So we're back with that vicious circle. And I think the general context where activists in trade unions on the left, on the ground, are faced with also problems like the capitulation of social democracy to neoliberal values, the loss of many thousands of activists from trade union activities. And so what I want to do is to look at the scale of what's happening, because we're also living through a time of intense change in the workplace. I'm going to talk mostly about higher education and the impact of these changes on the public sector and the contradictory results that they produce. Now that's mainly because that's where I work and organise, not because I think public sector workers are kind of privileged elite or anything like that, but also that it's the importation of mechanisms and procedures from the private sector, and the effects that are being produced provide a basis for unity, and often I think we're stuck with this, you know, waiting for struggle to emerge, and then rank and file organisation will appear. And I don't think that things happen like that. I think the extent to which rank and file activists can organise independently of the bureaucracy during times of struggle depends on part to the extent to which embryonic forms of rank and file organisation have been built in the period before that. And there's not time to go into the detail of that, but I think it's not something that spontaneously emerges. It is dependent on often how people organise precisely during periods like this. So what's been happening in higher education? In many ways it's the same as what's been happening in the civil service, in the health service, in schools. It's the importation of mechanisms that are designed to contribute to the dismantling of the public sector, not just in terms of privatising the sector, but dismantling the ethos of working for the common good, working for public concerns, to dismantle that ethos from within. And this has been a very deliberate and political and ideological process that's been going on, as people said this morning. It's part of an age-old fight for control in the workplace. It takes a specific form in the present era. But in 1985 there was a report produced called the Jarrett Report, which argued that university vice-chancellors should be considered not only as academic leaders but as chief executives. So it was part of a deliberate attempt to inculcate a private sector ethos into the public sector. So when Simon says, you know, managers don't know about the workplace, particularly under New Labour, this was considered a positive advantage, that people could come into sectors where they had absolutely no knowledge of the sector, because then they wouldn't be bound by any kind of corporate ties or affiliations or loyalties that would enable them just to come in and to manage. You know, so you get managers, and I've experienced this, who come in and say, I've dealt with restructurings before, there's nothing to it, and this is what's going to happen in your workplace. So the kind of headline thing that people latch onto is pay stratification, and it's a deliberate attempt to separate out people who were perhaps previously academics from the sector. But it's not just the individuals who head up the institutions. There are 900 to 1,000 people working in higher education who earn more than the Prime Minister, so big six-figure salaries. The ratio between the highest and the lowest paid in higher education is one of the highest ratios in the public sector, about 15 to 1. And that's part of a much more widespread process that was about reinventing universities as enterprises, so breaking faculties up into cost centres. This was exactly the same thing that happened in the civil service from the 1980s, and managing through centralisation, executive control, so a generalisation of the process of internal marketisation. So it produces ridiculous results. I mean, where I work, they created a kind of market for classrooms. So if you wanted to book a room, rooms they would charge higher prices for rooms at peak teaching times and lower prices, but what they found, they had to scrap it because everyone was putting their class at 9 o'clock or 5 o'clock. At 11 o'clock the classrooms were empty because it saved the department money. Completely crazy system, but it wasn't really about making the timetabling more efficient. It was about control in the workplace and changing the ethos. So again, the Jarrett report says universities are first and foremost corporate enterprises. The crucial issue is how a university achieves maximum value for money. So the introduction of cost centres, the setting of performance targets, all these arbitrary mechanisms, the introduction of the equivalent of Employee of the Month prizes. You can get Teacher of the Year prize or a PhD Supervisor of the Year prize, and all of this was an attempt to impose market discipline and new managerialism that reclassified staff as work units to be incentivised and measured, rather than if you take something like performance management, it's not about improving or incentivising performance, it's about subjecting people to scrutiny, to competition with their colleagues, and to create an audit culture that one of its objectives is just to neutralise dissent, to make people live in a constant state of anxiety and insecurity. So I think that's where, as Jane said in the first session, the overlap between arguments about the precarious nature of employment are not simply about whether there is a thing that exists called the precariat. It's about how a sense of insecurity is generated to impact on those in more stable jobs. So Kevin Dugan talks about the fact that, if you go, my students go to careers talks and they're told that, well, the idea of a career for life is over. You don't have a career for life anymore. Well, in actual fact, more people do stay longer in employment because employers need, there's a benefit to having a workforce that is stable and knows the job, but it also benefits them to create a sense of insecurity in the workplace, and that's what these mechanisms are designed to do. So also the creation of the notion that there's a perpetual financial crisis, that the sector is under threat, and therefore if you step out of line you're going to jeopardise our attempt to maintain the university or the school's status within the league tables and so on, so that pressure to stop people rebelling. So you start with very explicit government introduced mechanisms that seep into the workplace through a kind of incrementalism. You know, it's very rare for people to stand up in a school or a university and say, you know, we are a company and we should act like a company. It will be, well, these are mechanisms that have been introduced elsewhere, and that's what we're going to do here. So things which on the surface appear benign, notions of accountability or transparency or mechanisms like auditing or branding or performance management, appear neutral but perform a coercive function. So they have an impact on the workplace, and they produce a variety of responses, from compliance, acquiescence to resentment, bitterness, anger, and resistance. But the aim is to undermine social values of cooperation, solidarity, mutual aid, and to replace them with notions of competitiveness, profitability, and the measuring of outcomes, the measuring of performance, the auditing of processes, and the creation of a culture of fear. So this produces a sense of atomization that is also real. So when we talk about things like proletarianization, this is not a uniform process. There's an attempt to reduce the extent to which people have control over their own work, can operate independently and autonomously, but there's also a sense in which people are cajoled or given incentives to be co-opted and to become part of the system. So one of the elements in this is the expansion of managerialism. So if you look at universities over the past decade or so, the number of students has risen by 9 or 10%. The number of academics has risen by around 10%. The number of managers has increased by 33%. So there's a need for, you know, they're not making the system more efficient. They are there to supervise and control the workforce. So I think the way in which this impacts on and where it's relevant to what we do as trade unionists is that often it's not, these measures exist and continue to exist not because people consent to them, openly consent to them and see them as a good thing. It's more about the culture of compliance, which is a very double-edged phenomenon. So there are various, I mean, in France there's a huge literature on this kind of this kind of stuff, where people talk about people outwardly complying with things which they know to be ridiculous. And in practice, people will have experienced this. You'll be in a meeting and people will say, yes, we have to do this, how can we do it? And then outside the meeting they'll say, yeah, this is a load of shit. Why are we putting up with it? And it's that produces, and this I think is a problem, is that there is this simmering resentment that can get channeled and individualised in our response to it. So union reps find their time taken up with grievance cases or disciplinary cases, or, you know, the individualisation of the mess that's being created creates a burden that in turn hampers the ability to produce a collective response. And then the result is measured in increased levels of stress. So the Work Foundation produced a report that shows satisfaction levels have fallen against every single measure defining the contract between employees and their workplace. Productivity per head has stagnated as job satisfaction has roughly halved. So this is the point as well, is these mechanisms perform a function in terms of discipline and control. They don't actually do any good in terms of the thing that the workplace is supposed to exist to produce. It makes an education or a health service or social work harder to achieve. So there's a sense then that the essential element of what these techniques are introduced to oversee is being undermined by that very process of commodification and marketisation. So you get, and this again is an age-old thing, where you have these, what Harry Braverman calls subterranean streams of resentment and resistance that exist below the surface. And so it's about how do we relate to very specific things like outsourcing, inequality over pay, casualisation, the increasing marginalisation of women in the workforce. That you know, in universities it's not just about a gender pay gap, it's about how processes like the research assessment exercise or putting people on teaching only contracts disproportionately affect women. But just to end really, the experience that I've had where I work is, on the one hand, we had a big dispute a few years ago that did all the things that disputes are supposed to do. It increased the level of union membership, it gave people a sense that there was a possibility of a collective means of addressing questions, I think particularly as internal mechanisms for expressing dissatisfaction or disagreement are narrowing, that the workplace is becoming less democratic. It means there's an opportunity for the union to exist as the forum where people go if they're pissed off about some nitty-gritty aspect of their work. And we developed a structure of reps that was, you know, beyond anything we'd been able to contemplate before. And this is in a workplace where, when I started about 20 years ago, people didn't even used to talk about management. They talked about the administrators, or they talked about the college as this abstract thing. There's that sense of us and them, which people can feel crushed by. They can feel powerless as part of that. And yes, struggle, as people said in the first session, does provide an opportunity for people to develop a sense of collective strength and confidence. But it doesn't solve all the problems just because you've had a strike, because management will come back, and they've come back and, aided by the government, there are further divisions that are imposed upon the workforce, separating out administrators from academics, centralising the administration, so there's a greater command structure, pitting students against university staff, and so on. So there's a potential for the link between those individual grievances and resentments that build up and impoverish people's working lives, and a much more general assault on neoliberalism and what it's doing, that makes sense of the slogans that we use about defending the NHS or defending education and so on, but they have to be related to concrete circumstances if they're to have any influence. Otherwise, it's just abstract sloganeering. Some of the most effective meetings we had that had the biggest attendance were meetings about how do we deal with the new managerialism. And people would come and they'd talk about issues that appear to be on their own insignificant, but build up into a picture where what's happening to universities or any other workplace, the degradation of work and the working environment, and the sense that people can have a collective response is something that I think we all need to think about how, and I'm not saying that we have a blueprint or have been particularly successful, but those are the kind of issues that we need to be grappling with if we're to begin to address the bigger vicious circle that can appear something that there's no outlet, there's no means of overcoming. But I think that the situation that's been created shows that there is a potential slowly to provide the basis for overcoming some of those difficulties that we face.